Well, I'm an archaeologist, but I don't feel like a technician. I see my profession as historian who is practicing archaeology. And my work is in three avenues, so to speak, three lines. First of all, I'm doing, the usual conservative archaeology. I'm excavating at the site of Megiddo, and I'm doing archaeological work in the Negev and so on. Secondly, more and more in recent years, I have turned into the side of archaeosciences, which means incorporation of methods from the exact and life sciences to archaeology. So I am doing project on paleoclimate, I'm doing project in ancient DNA, I'm working with mathematicians on studying ancient inscriptions, and I'm doing radiocarbon dating and so on. This is becoming a very important side of archaeology. Modern archaeology is more and more on this side. And finally, I have another hat, which once in a while I put on my head. I am also doing biblical history. I am deeply interested in biblical studies. I'm reading a lot about biblical studies, and I'm more and more courageous now to write my own articles on topics which are related to biblical studies, related to archaeology or not, sometimes pure criticism as well. So this is my professional work. I went to Megiddo 21 years ago with the goal to recheck the entire stratigraphic scheme of the Levant in the Bronze and Iron Ages and the entire chronological system. Megiddo is the cradle of biblical archaeology, or archaeology of the Levant, if you wish. Everything starts there. All the problems are related to this site, and I felt that in order to understand better the archaeology of the history of the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, I need to go to the central site. So I started there, and I have also made Megiddo into some sort of a laboratory for experimenting new methods in archaeology. So, for instance, Megiddo was one of the first sites where you could see a laboratory, a chemistry, if you wish, laboratory, checking sediments on site. And Megiddo is the place where we practice microarchaeology, which means what you see under the microscope more than in other places. I believe, with my team at Megiddo, that archaeology has two aspects to it. There's the macro side, what you can see with the naked eye, buildings, walls, pottery, jewelry, and so on. And there is a whole world of microarchaeology that you cannot see with the naked eye. And this is very important. And without it, you cannot really reach firm conclusions about the past, because it can tell you about destructions, about materials, about all sorts of things that can be about archaeobotany and so on, about vegetation in antiquity that cannot be seen with the naked eye. And this is what we are doing and experimenting at Megiddo in the last few years. Yes, dating is important because I'm doing history. As I told you before, I'm a historian practicing archaeology. When you wish to reconstruct history, the most important thing, with archaeology, the most important thing is to know where you are or when you are, to know about dating. It's all about dating, which means historical reconstruction can change dramatically with the change of 60, 50, 40 years in the dating of a monument. So we need to know where we are. Traditional dating in archaeology was based very much on one's understanding of the biblical testimony, but this brought about many circular argumentations, which are less than ideal, of course. So 20 years ago, when I started this big debate regarding the chronology of the Iron Age layers and Iron Age monuments, a debate which is essential for reconstructing biblical history, right? So we started with archaeology, with traditional archaeology. But about 15 years ago, we turned slowly to radiocarbon studies. And basically what I suggested is that there has been a major mistake in dating because of this circular argument, and that between the 11th century BC and the end of the 9th century BC, there was a mistake of about 50, 60, 70 years in the dating. And this is what some of my colleagues in Europe later called the Finkelstein Correction, which means if you correct the dating, you come up with a different history. And I started, by arguing my arguments, according to traditional concepts of archaeology. And then 15 years ago or so, I turned to radiocarbon, and radiocarbon studies, as far as I understand, fully support my view. A very uneasy relationship, but I still think that it can be done, which means I think the reconstruction of the history of ancient Israel in the Iron Age, Persian period, and Hellenistic is extremely important for those who are interested in history, in archaeology, in biblical studies, in theology, in other fields, anthropology as well. And this can be done, but it should be done in a different way than before. It should be done highly professionally on the side of archaeology, with dating, direct dating, radiocarbon dating, and so on of finds. It must be done with the ancient the records of the ancient Near East, mainly Assyrian records, but also others. And then, of course, the biblical material. The Bible cannot be ignored. The Bible is important. Even if part of the material is not exactly history, but more on the side of layers of myth, still those layers depict the ideas of the people who put them in writing. And it is extremely important, but it is important to use the Bible critically. And here I stand with more and more on the side of Central European scholarship, which means German, Swiss, mainly scholarship, which is the core of European scholarship in biblical studies, and I find myself standing with them and studying and learning from them. So my approach to the biblical text is critical. But I do think that we must include the Bible when we try to reconstruct history of the Iron Age. It is a very tricky question, Ademar, and I'll tell you why. Archaeology is a little bit like a profession, to be a pilot, which means that there are people who can be pilots, and there are people who will never be pilots. Because in order to be a pilot, you need a certain understanding of the three dimensions. Archaeology is the same. I met people who came to the field for the first time and understood archaeology just like that. And I know people who were with me, without naming names, for many years in the field and do not understand archaeology at all. Because it has to do with the ability to reconstruct in your imagination a three-dimensional situation. And not every person can do this. So the first thing that if you want to be an archaeologist, you better find out in advance whether you can master the situation in the field, because the field is important, the field is the beginning. And then I think that you need to assemble a good team. A good team is the key for everything. I am extremely lucky, maybe also a little bit talented in assembling a good team. I have wonderful young people working with me. And my success is their success and vice versa. And training students in the field is something that I like more than many other things. There is no better feeling than seeing a student of mine who comes to the field, understands nothing, and becomes an archaeologist after, one or two or three campaigns. So, and then there are the other elements of being critical, of being open-minded, of employing the proper techniques, of being always in the front line of documentation from the using the proper devices for documentation and so on. So this goes without saying, of course, but in the beginning, there's the question whether you can understand a three-dimensional situation. I strongly think that there must be a distinction between faith and archaeology. Faith is about a person's understanding of life, about a person's understanding of his being, his existence, vis-a-vis the world, vis-a-vis family, vis-a-vis values, and so on, vis-a-vis God, if one is a believer, while archaeology is an academic discipline. So there must be a complete distinction. I sincerely believe that a believer can be a good archaeologist and a non-believer can be a bad archaeologist. I mean, there must be an iron curtain between the two. I get many emails from all over the world. People read my books. Some of my books are also popular books that go to the public. People read and people then write to me. I try to answer always. And I get all sorts of messages, some of them more friendly and some of them less. I'm not getting out of my way, both on the side of the happy messages and also I'm not getting too annoyed when I get a less than friendly message. However, I am horrified when I get messages once in a while telling me that I read your book or I read a book by somebody else about biblical history, and because of what you're writing, I feel that I lose my faith. Then I become really depressed from this. It is shocking for me. And I always answer at length, and I explain at length why there must be a distinction. And there is no connection. One can understand critical approach to archaeology and critical approach to biblical studies and to the history of ancient Israel, and at the same time not lose his or her faith. There is no connection between the two, and God forbid if because of me somebody changes his or her way of life. Great pleasure. I like very much coming here. It's not my first time here. I was here before. I always love to be in Brazil and meet Brazilian people, and I hope to come again.